Greetings and bienvenue, midnight crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
An unusual event took place in the second half of November. It was a time when rain and snow were falling almost incessantly from the sky, and when the muddy ground was freezing in the evenings. It took place on the coast of the North Sea, whose black waters were impenetrable by the dull winter light even at noon, when the sun was at its highest point in the sky. Its zenith, however, was not so high above the horizon, and its rays bounced on the black water with orange highlights, creating a strange harmony of colors. Astrid, a rather famous but highly eccentric local artist, meanwhile, spent her days at the seaside. She lived alone in a huge house by the sea, away from all sources of human bustle, and, despite her fame, she never, at least deliberately, showed herself in public. No one could say anything with any certainty about her way of life. On those rare days where she held exhibitions of her new work, journalists would literally turn themselves inside out in an attempt to find out some interesting information about her. But, to their bitter dismay, Astrid most often did not show up at such parties at all. She never worked in one particular style. Each of her paintings had details from different artistic movements, and only one thing was common to all of them: distorted colors. Sometimes they were altered only slightly so that the discrepancy was not striking, but only created an emotional background, and sometimes the landscapes took on such dissonant hues that it was hard to look at the paintings. On those gloomy, dreary winter days, Astrid felt a kind of mental longing for that imminent inspiration. She was already bored with the age-old seascapes, and she was preparing to paint something out of the ordinary. She took long walks along the shoreline, with the ice and sand crunching underfoot and the low sun turning everything reddish. It made her feel disconnected from the world. Not just from the world, but from the world of living people and real events. Her imagination wandered beyond the ordinary into spheres beyond the mind and searched there for the subjects of future paintings. She wandered the coast of the North Sea for days, sometimes even in the dark, not returning to her own home for almost 24 hours. Sometimes she would take a camera with her and photograph the water and the sky if they took on unusual hues, but more often she would simply walk along the endless shoreline separating the water and land with a thin and brittle crust of ice. Having gathered her impressions, she would return to her house, which was essentially her enormous studio. The house was large, but inside it consisted of just one room filled with a variety of art supplies. Creative chaos reigned there. There were sketches, outlines, sketches everywhere. Astrid usually puts them on paper at night. The house, in fact, was equipped with the latest technology and had a well-thought-out functional design. One of its facades, the western one, faced the sea and had one huge window. The house stood on the edge of a cliff overhanging the sea, so that one could rarely find a view more beautiful in its simplicity than from this window. Astrid was especially fond of the sunset during a storm, when the foaming waves rose so high that they swept over this grand window, slamming into it and shaking the house, and the red rays of the setting sun shines through the shaky veil and shimmered on all the furnishings. It was scary and beautiful. The rampant forces of the elements, wind, water, made Astrid feel horror mixed with admiration and delight. Sometimes the raging waves threw in the window sea residents lifted from the bottom, jellyfish, squids, cuttlefish, which sucked on the front window and slowly slid back into the sea. There was also a fireplace in the house. It was huge, made of large, roughly hewn pieces of gray granite. In front of it lay an imposing gray pelt with long hair, and beneath the wall was a large leather couch, formerly white but now stained with colorful stains of oil paint. There was also a basement in the house equipped as living quarters, but Astrid was rarely in it, preferring to spend her few hours of sleep on the very couch next to the humming, smoky fireplace. As mentioned, she was more than an eccentric person with a difficult personality. She was in her early 30s and had been living alone ever since everyone close to her had left her. Not that her family didn't love her, but somehow none of them could stay by her side for too long. Astrid wasn't even saddened by this. It was as if she hadn't even noticed this abstraction. She had too many things she loved more than people. She was completely self-sufficient and did not need society. On the contrary, it oppressed her. Most of the time, she was immersed in her own fantasies and images dictated by her unprecedented imagination, and anything that distracted her from these reveries was regarded by her as an external irritant to be eliminated immediately. Perhaps, during the years of solitary life she was a little out of her mind, listening only to the rustle of waves on the sand, the howling wind and the cries of gulls. But perhaps she was like that all her life. Somewhere she took the images for her canvases, but in solitude her perception of the world has sharpened to an incredible subtlety. It was a rainy evening. The clouds of heaven had opened so wide that the space around Astrid's house seemed like one solid wall of water, beginning in the sky and flowing into the raging sea. She sat cross-legged on the floor and drew on a small piece of paper the images that had burst into her consciousness that day. The sea roared, foaming. The wind groaned. She took an occasional break from her work to gaze admiringly through the gigantic window, almost opaque because of the torrents of water that were pouring down on it. The fire in the fireplace cast ghostly shadows that danced across the room. The anticipation of something great gripped Astrid more and more. Here in her imagination the fundamental image of the new picture began to form. It became clearer and clearer, and she concentrated entirely on her sketch, forgetting even to look at the storm. Time passed, the storm did not think of abating, and only the roar of the elements could be heard on the shore at this time. Suddenly the panoramic window shook with a violent bang. Astrid shuddered and dropped her pencil. She was completely immersed in her reverie, and the loud sound startled her, snapping her out of her slumber into reality. The glass was reinforced, so there was no fear that it would shatter even if the sea threw a rock at it. But it wasn't a blow, it was a smack. Something big and soft was thrown by the wave through the window. Astrid shook her head, pushing the illusion away, and continued drawing. Within a minute, the slap was repeated. Astrid flinched, staring frightened into the glass, but there was nothing but waves. She put the pencil aside and, looking warily into the opening, began to wait. A minute. Another. Whistling, roaring, and groaning of the elements. Nothing. She calmed down a little. 5 minutes, nothing. 7, 8. Still the same roar of the elements. She picked up her pencil again. A marvelous image appeared on the paper, unknown shapes, mysterious outlines. Something of the otherworldly reality was visible in these sketches. But they had no meaning, only strange, partly terrible forms. She drew with inspiration, oblivious to everything else. Astrid plunged headlong into a wonderful world of fantasy, inventing the non-existent, and so she sat for many more hours until the emerging dawn proclaimed a new day. She dozed off on the gray hide that served as both a carpet and chair. As she slept, strange images of the living essence of the universe continued to overtake her. Yes, she was crazy after all. Just awake, she ran ashore, raising her arms to the orange sun that had taken its position low over the horizon. Astrid walked around her house and out onto the coastal sand below the cliff. And here she stopped dead in her tracks. It was unclear what had stopped her from screaming. There was something laying on the surf line. Something that looked like a naked human body. The body had been frozen into the coastal edge of the ice overnight and was now fluttering lifelessly in the rolling waves. Astrid clamped her hand over her mouth and approached her discovery. The body was so pale that it appeared transparent, and the November frost gave it a dead blue. It looked like a human body, but it was not. It was too fragile, too delicate, too transparent. Astrid squatted down beside it. Suppressing terror, she rolled the creature onto its back. She immediately recoiled from it. Before her stretched something with the perfect features of a frosted face and no sexual features whatsoever.
"Oh my God,"
bursted out in Astrid's mouth. "What is it?" She sat next to the incomprehensible creature and could not believe in its reality. Where did it come from? She thought. From the depths of the sea. Where could such a thing come from? What is it? Why was it here? She sat beside the body, staring into it, asking unanswerable questions. The longer she stared, the clearer she realized she had never seen such faceless perfection. After a while she made up her mind. She ran into her house, to her bedroom, pulled the blanket off the bed, and returned to the shore. She wrapped the body up and tried to lift it. The body was unusually light, as if it consisted not of flesh, but of sea foam. Astrid carried it into the house. She laid it on the floor and immediately grabbed her pencil, drawing its perfect features on the paper. The fireplace was still burning, but the sunlight streaming in through the huge window kept the glare of the fire from dancing on the walls. Astrid didn't care. Though she only drew at night by the light of a living flame, she did one drawing after another that day, fearing that such a beautiful but dead body would quickly deteriorate. There were no clocks in the house. Astrid could orient herself only by the sun. And then, when it was half hidden on the sea surface, she set aside the pencil and the entire sketchbook. She felt incredibly tired, fear lurking and overexcitation of the nervous system. Her disembodied images of yesterday were beginning to take on flesh, and it was the dead body spread out on the floor in the folds of the blanket. As dusk fell, it began to glow. Astrid was frightened, but her creative frenzy kept her awake. She was beginning to understand why the great artists of bygone eras had such incredible images in their paintings that made her want to live and die. She had a model in front of her that allowed her to create a masterpiece. But she was exhausted. The ominous images and strange events were wearing her down, and she felt that if she didn't get a couple of hours of sleep, she wouldn't make it. But sleeping in the same room with the dead body of an unknown creature was creepy to her, and dragging the body outside was a problem as the storm was over and the seagulls would come and not leave a piece of skin on it. As she pondered, she slipped imperceptibly into sleep right on top of the gray hide. She was awakened by the sound of breaking glass. Astrid, shaking off her sleep, opened her eyes and dazed in wild horror. A luminous, inhuman body, as if blinded, rushed around the room, demolishing all sorts of utensils in its path. It slammed against the walls like a bird that had flown into the room. It was darting around, bumping into things scattered on the floor. It didn't make a sound. Astrid, without a second thought, lurched to the hide. Panic was creeping up her brain, but her body was petrified with fear. There were no thoughts. She laid with her eyes wide open and watched the creature's spasmodic movements. The creature was thrashing around senselessly. It seemed like it was being controlled by a puppeteer, so absurd were its movements and postures. After an hour, it was probably exhausted, and bumping its chest against the glass of the panoramic window, it collapsed and fell silent. Astrid was afraid to move. She lay motionless until morning. When the light of a new day illuminated the room, she found the courage to change her posture and sit up. The creature did not move. Astrid sat for some time, keeping her wary gaze on it. In time, during which nothing happened, she became bold enough to slowly crawl toward the lying body. It looked different this morning, pale but alive, and its chest was heaving slightly from breathing. It was just unconscious. Astrid didn't know what to do. She was afraid. She still didn't know how dangerous this creature was. Yes, its movements in the night were more like a frightened thrashing than an act of aggression, but still. She didn't dare touch it and went outside. The dim sun was barely shining, and Astrid slowly wandered her familiar route, trying to comprehend the insane events and get rid of the trembling in her knees. The edge of the ice crunches. The sea calmly rolls waves onto the shore, washing away her traces. There is no wind. Sand mounds cast thick shadows, and tufts of withered, frost-covered grass stood still. After 2 kilometers, it seemed to her that everything was just a bad dream. Shells on the shoal. The rustling of sand underfoot. She was beginning to think she was losing her mind rather than actually seeing what had happened. The cries of the seagulls. Everything is so ordinary, so familiar, so beautiful. After another 2 kilometers, she squatted and laughed. Astrid sifted the coarse white sand through her fingers and thought to herself that no matter how it turned out, she had unsurpassed sketches, whether the creature was a figment of her inflamed imagination or a real unknown creature. Sea foam washed over her boots all the way. Her feet were wet and cold, but that wasn't what prompted her to turn back. A morbid curiosity. Curiosity mixed with a desire to create. She went home. At first she was resolute, but the closer she got to her house, the more cowardly her consciousness became. On the threshold, after a moment of indecision, Astrid managed to overcome her fear and opened the front door. The room was silent. She looked around and saw it. It was sitting, leaning against the extinguished but still warm fireplace, with its arms around itself, and looking at her. A shiver went through Astrid. The creature was looking at her intently with bright green eyes. This was the first time Astrid had seen those eyes. If she had seen them in a picture, she would have said they were magical. Now she thought they were all pervasive. Astrid took a step. The creature didn't move, it just stared. There was no emotion in its gaze. Another step, nothing. Astrid covered the distance to the center of the room, and the creature continued to watch her immovably. Alive, it was even more beautiful. Astrid cautiously sat down on the floor and, keeping her gaze on it, reached for a blank sheet of paper. In that pose, displaying its utter helplessness and fear yet doomed calm, it seemed something supernatural. Though it probably was. Taking the familiar objects in her hands, Astrid was no longer nervous. Inspiration killed fear, and she drew and drew. When the second sketchbook was finished, she put it aside and took a deep breath. The strange creature did not seem to change her pose. It was evening again. Astrid, slightly familiar with the situation, and realizing that the creature was unlikely to attack her, cautiously approached it. In her creative frenzy, she didn't notice that it was cold, that it was naked, huddled against the long cooled stones, wrapping its thin arms around itself. Astrid decided to make contact. She removed her robe from the couch and held it out to the creature. The creature fell back frightened, huddling harder against the wall. Then she threw the robe over it like a blanket. The creature spasmed, but realizing that Astrid hadn't hurt it, clutched its thin fingers into the warm fabric, trying ineptly to wrap itself around it. Astrid took a step back. The creature watched her with its incredible eyes. She left it and went into the bedroom. She was almost unafraid. It snowed that night. It fell from the starless sky in white spiky crumbs and melted into the bluish waves just by touching them. It fell monotonously, and the wind blew it in different directions. By morning the whole beach was covered with snow drifts, and a sharp frost had decorated the panoramic window of Astrid's house with icy patterns. She woke up. She went up to the studio. Quietly she stepped over the threshold and froze. The creature was sitting in front of the window, touching the bizarre ice ligature with its fingertips. Its clear jade eyes expressed surprise, and Astrid looked with admiration at this strange creature. At his perfect proportion, at the smoothness of his curves and outlines, at the amazing grace that was evident in even his most insignificant movements. She was afraid of frightening him, but she called out anyway, drawing his attention. The creature shuddered and turned its gaze to Astrid.
Don't be afraid of me,
Astrid said, and walked a few steps closer to the creature. This time the creature didn't recoil. It just sat there, gazing intently into Astrid's face. It didn't blink. At least, Astrid didn't see its eyelids move. She squatted beside the creature and couldn't think of what to do next. Finally, she decided to talk to it. Astrid highly doubted that the creature would understand her, and moreover, she was not sure that the creature could talk at all, for all the time, even in the moment of utmost fright. It had not made a sound, but she figured that since it had responded to her call, it could hear. Astrid began to tell it about herself, her home, and her profession. Her voice was calm and her intonations were friendly. She did not make any sudden movements, but simply spoke. After a while she noticed with satisfaction that the creature had calmed down. Its pale palms stopped trembling and its fingers stopped rubbing the fabric of its robe. And it wasn't looking at her as intently as before. Like an acquaintance took its place. Suddenly it occurred to Astrid that she had forgotten to eat for 2 days in a row. Immediately the thought was interrupted by a counter-thought, and this creature. What does it eat? It has a mouth, therefore it must eat something. Pondering this, Astrid headed for the kitchen. She had never bothered to cook. She had better things to do. Once a week she had a delivery man come to her house and fill her fridge with all the groceries she needed. Astrid didn't often wonder what her lunches consisted of, so now she explored the contents of the refrigerator with undisguised surprise. She piled up some vegetables, cuts of meat, some foil-baked but unidentifiable dishes, and turned around to put it all on the table. It stood in the kitchen doorway. Astrid almost dropped the food from her hands in surprise.
Well, come here now.
The creature obediently approached her. Does it really understand me? The thought flashed through her head.
Choose what you will have.
Astrid continued and pointed to the food. The creature did not respond. Then Astrid cut a slice of bread, put a few slices of ham and a large leaf of lettuce on it. She cut the sandwich in half, took a bite of it herself, and handed the other to the creature. It cautiously reached out and took what was offered. At first it just stared at the sandwich, then carefully took a bite. Astrid noticed that its teeth were not quite human. That is, almost, but not quite. Apparently the creature liked the treat because it had finished it. At least now Astrid knew that its diet was no different from her own. Next came the weirdness. No matter what Astrid did, no matter where she went, this strange creature followed her. Didn't do anything. It just tailed her and wouldn't let her out of its sight. She didn't like it. Thoughts of it tracking her began to creep into her head. To get rid of that feeling, Astrid decided to go for a walk. She put on a warm jacket and went ashore. The snow continued to fall from the sky, but now in flakes rather than crumbs. It had already covered the entire sand of the beach with a thin layer, and by evening it was obviously going to cover the ground in earnest. A few hundred meters away from the house, Astrid heard a quiet rustle behind her. She turned around. Behind her, 10 meters away, was it. Barefoot. Clothed only in a robe that didn't even cover his knees. His feet were blue with cold and his body was shivering. With trembling hands he wrapped himself in the thin fabric, blown through by the icy wind. In spite of this, the creature was clearly and determined to follow Astrid until it stiffened to death. Astrid spluttered her arms. She ran to it, picked up its light body in her arms, and ran into the house.
What are you doing?
She wailed, laying the creature on the couch in front of the fireplace, and started the fire. She was beginning to realize that this creature, though it looked like a person, was in fact closer to an animal. A dog or a cat. At least, it behaved about the same. Astrid covered him with the plaid and sat down next to him, watching. The creature lay there, still trembling, and stared at her with a devoted look. She stroked its golden hair and said thoughtfully,
It seems, my friend, you're not going anywhere from me. And why not? After all, live here, I'll paint you. With a model like you, I'll probably be the happiest artist on earth.
Astrid grinned at her words. It was true.
What is your name?
She asked the creature. The creature, of course, did not answer. It lay with its legs drawn up to its stomach and watched. Astrid laughed.
I was joking. Of course, you won't tell me, I already understood. And if so, then I'll call you. Well, say, Leonardo. A real boy should have a real name, shouldn't he? Huh, Leo?
Astrid laughed again, and Leo, to her greatest surprise, smiled back. He had a pleasant smile, kind of naively carefree. Astrid thought again that if dogs and cats could smile, they would do it with that expression on their faces. Leo was a surprisingly gentle and affectionate creature. As Astrid had suggested, it was intellectually much closer to an animal than to a human, but, nevertheless, it had a surprisingly subtle sense of beauty. It could look at Astrid's paintings for hours. Sometimes, Leo would point out the almost imperceptible inaccuracies in the proportions with his tiny finger. With his help and Astrid's participation, Astrid created masterpiece paintings. The public was shocked. Her painting, entitled Child of the Elements, was recognized as the most amazing work created in the 21st century. This picture was grandly exhibited in museums. They worked on Child of the Elements throughout the winter. Since the arrival of Leo in Astrid's life, she no longer needed the long winter walks by the sea. She was no longer looking for inspiration. Leonardo became her muse and helper. All day long they painted. Leo posed, mixing paints, and Astrid applied his amazing features to the canvas. Strange as it was, Leo immediately began to mix exactly the kind of distorted colors that Astrid used. Obviously, she liked this. After a 12-hour or even longer day of work, when their hands could no longer hold the brushes and their eyes were watery, they would stop working and Astrid would make dinner. Leo proved to be a not picky eater, and he was perfectly happy with the half-finished meals Astrid herself ate. One day, when it was too dark outside and the wind was blowing so hard that ashes from the fireplace flew across the room, Astrid turned on the music. She very seldom turned to external stimulants of the imagination. She didn't need them. Her mind was so full of imaginative chaos that anything external only irritated her. But that night was too depressing. She turned on the tape recorder that had been idle for years. As the music poured from the speakers, Leo froze, spinning his head around in surprise. His jade eyes sparkled with delight. After listening to half of the composition, Leo began to dance. Astrid froze. It moved so smoothly and gracefully that it was impossible to look away. It danced through the night, and Astrid watched. They made it a rule from then on. Out of an old habit, Astrid slept on the couch. She put her bedroom at Leo's disposal, but Leo slept only on the gray hide. No amount of force Astrid could change his mind about sleeping in a comfortable bed. Leo never parted from Astrid. It followed her everywhere. No dog, of which Astrid had many, was as devoted as this strange creature. It would sleep on the floor just to be near its patroness. Not even on the floor. It could sleep in the snow. Sometimes it had nightmares. Then, whimpering softly, it would curl up in a ball on the blanket at Astrid's feet and calm down. Astrid didn't mind. Leo had almost no weight, and it didn't bother her at all. That's how the winter went. They made a lot of money and became very close-knit. As spring came, when the snow came off and the sun began to rise above the horizon, Astrid resumed her walks. Now they were walking together. Leo began to smile more and more as he looked at the sea and the sun. It was running along the beach, picking up shells and pebbles. It must have been happy. Sometimes when they came home, Leo would bring Astrid crayons. In some elusive way, he would explain exactly what he wanted Astrid to draw. And Astrid would draw for him. As it turned out, Leo loved the sea. Whenever there was a storm, he would pull Astrid to the window, lay down on her lap, and watch the unrestrained frenzy of wind and water with rapt attention. So measuredly spring flowed into summer. Each day the sun rose higher and warmer. The storm season was over and the hurricane wind was replaced by a warm breeze. The sea became calm and warm. Astrid and Leo often splashed in its waves in the morning. Astrid had a small boat. There were days when they'd take it out to sea and sail for hours and hours through the azure waters. They would sail away to places where no shore was visible, where the endless expanse was filled with salty, splashing winds. During such trips, Astrid forgot that there was anything else in the world. She felt completely free. Everything around her was so harmonious. There was nothing unnecessary. All external irritants remained on the shore. Astrid had a new painting in mind. This time a landscape. The kind of landscape that could depict and capture her perception of the reality around her. All summer she was gathering impressions, analyzing them, sorting them, selecting the necessary ones and discarding the useless ones. All this she did almost continuously and, to some extent, unconsciously. She just looked at the sky and the sun, at the sea and the endless expanse, and her brain itself marked and remembered the necessary shades, colors, positions. Leo was always with her. He participated in everything and in the creation of images too. Without him, the shades would have been different. After all, the shades of colors in Astrid's paintings reflected the nuances of her mood. As the days grew colder, Astrid began to prepare. The canvas was supposed to be large, so she had a lot of preparatory work to do. Leo became more serious, too. He realized that the carefree days of sunshine and mindless relaxation had come to an end, and a period of thoughtful creation was beginning. The period of creation. The period of creating a masterpiece. It rejoiced. However, now it was always happy. Anticipating the long hours to come, devoted to the materialization of disembodied images of consciousness into the most beautiful work of art, Leo helped Astrid in everything, trying to bring that moment closer. It was as if time had taken a complete turn and returned to its starting point. Astrid spent all day painting again. She painted to the point of exhaustion, until her hands were so numb they couldn't hold the brushes. Leo learned how to cook. Seeing how tired Astrid was, he made cooking his responsibility. But even in this uncomplicated task it managed to add a touch of beauty. The sandwiches and salads in its hands were works of art. They were always in harmony in color and content. In the evenings Astrid began to play music more often. For Leo's sake, she even ordered some new DVDs. Sunlight was creation, moonlight was relaxation. A succession of autumn days draped in a haze of happiness. The big canvas was only half finished when one morning Leo was unable to wake her. Her cold body was sprawled on the white sofa. Astrid Beta had died in her sleep. Her brain must have been unable to withstand the emotional strain that accompanied the act of creating such an unthinkable image. Leo shook Astrid. It crumpled her clothes helplessly with its hands, stroked her long, tangled hair, and, even though it realized what had happened, it would not abandon its doomed attempts to awaken her from her sleep. But it was an eternal dream. Then it fell silent. It sat down next to the sofa and, resting its head on Astrid's chest, began to howl softly. Time passed its course. More than once the sun set into the sea, and more than once it rose again. But Leo never got away from Astrid's dead body. It whimpered, it ran through her hair, and it howled at night. The weeks went by. Leo had grown thin and almost translucent with grief. It wept all day long, clinging to Astrid's withered arms. It called out for her. When Leo himself came close to death, he grabbed the paints that had belonged to Astrid and began to paint with confident strokes. It was finishing what Astrid had left incomplete. Its strokes lay one on top of the other. It was drawing outlines, gathering color and volume. It was frantic and unstoppable. Something that had nothing to do with human creation was emerging from his brush. What came out could no longer be considered a masterpiece. The execution was perfect, but the colors, the content, they exuded horror and engendered despair by their very sight. It was a picture of a dystopia. When Leo had finished, he turned the canvas toward Astrid's body and returned to its place. He sat down next to the couch, rested his head on his mother's chest, and waited to die.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.